In the ancient kingdom of Verilith, nestled between the towering cliffs of the starlit mountains and the endless expanse of the azure sea, there lived two princes, Arden the elder, noble and beloved, and Cedric the younger, cunning and ambitious. They were the sons of King Halvor, a wise and just ruler whose kingdom prospered under his reign. Prince Arden, with his golden hair and warm demeanor, was the embodiment of the future king that the people of Verilith yearned for. He was to inherit his father's throne and wed the beautiful Princess Elowyn, whose grace and beauty were known across the lands. The love between Arden and Elowyn was pure and deep, a union that promised prosperity and happiness for the kingdom. But in the shadow of Arden's light stood Cedric, the second-born prince. Cedric's envy festered in the dark recesses of his heart, growing with each passing day. The thought of his brother sitting on the throne, of Arden holding Elowyn's hand in marriage, was a bitter pill to swallow for Cedric's soul. He had always been in Arden's shadow, never receiving the adoration and respect he craved. The kingdom's love for his brother only deepened Cedric's resentment, and he began to plot. Cedric's hatred finally culminated on the day when Arden invited him for a hunt along the cliffs overlooking the Azure Sea. The cliffs, known for the breathtaking views, also held a dangerous beauty, with jagged rocks below where the sea met the land in a violent embrace. Cedric saw this as an opportunity. As the brothers stood on the edge of the cliffs, Arden, unaware of his brother's dark thoughts, spoke of his excitement for the future, of ruling Verilith and marrying Elowyn. Cedric's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword, his mind racing with his wicked plan. "Cedric, my brother," Arden said with a smile that cut through Cedric's heart like a dagger, "I wish for nothing more than for us to rule together, to make our father proud." Cedric forced a smile, the taste of bile rising in his throat. "Of course, Arden. We will make him proud together." But as Arden turned to admire the view, Cedric's smile faded. He drew his sword silently, his heart pounding in his chest. The time had come. With one swift motion, Cedric lunged forward and drove his brother to the ground. Arden, taken by surprise, tumbled forward, his hands desperately grabbing at the cliff's edge. He clung to the rocky ledge, his fingers bloodied from the sharp stones. The sea roared below, and the wind howled around them, as if nature itself sensed the impending tragedy. "Cedric!" Arden gasped, his voice filled with disbelief and fear. "What are you doing?" Cedric stood over him, the cold steel of his sword glinting in the sunlight. His eyes were void of emotion, his face a mask of determination. "This kingdom," Cedric began, his voice calm and steady, "will be mine. I will marry Elowyn, and I will sit on our father's throne. You were always meant to be King Arden, but not anymore." Arden's heart raced, not from the physical strain of holding onto the cliff, but from the shock of his brother's betrayal. "You don't have to do this, Cedric," he pleaded. "We can rule together, as you said." But Cedric shook his head slowly, his expression hardening. "There's only one throne, Arden, and it will be mine." Arden's fingers slipped slightly, the rough stone cutting deeper into his flesh. "Please, Cedric," he begged, tears welling in his eyes. "I am your brother." Cedric stepped closer, looking down at Arden with cold, calculating eyes. "And that is why I must do this myself." With a final cruel push of his boot, Cedric stomped on Arden's fingers, prying them from the cliff's edge. Arden's scream echoed through the cliffs as he plummeted into the churning sea below. The jagged rocks reached up like the claws of some ancient beast, and the waves crashed with a deafening roar as they claimed the body of the elder prince. Cedric stood on the edge, watching as the sea swallowed Arden. For a moment he felt a pang of guilt, a shadow of the love he once had for his brother, but it was quickly overshadowed by the anticipation of what was to come. The throne, the kingdom, and Elowin would all be his. Unbeknownst to Cedric, the Azure Sea was not just a body of water. It was a living force, ancient and powerful, with secrets and mysteries hidden within its depths. The sea was home to countless creatures, some known to men and others only whispered of in legends. Among them were bone pickers, creatures neither fish nor bird, with long, needle-like beaks and ravenous appetites for flesh. They lived in the deep crevices beneath the waves, emerging only when the scent of blood called to them. As Arden's body sank into the depths, the bone pickers swarmed. Their beaks tore through his flesh with a frenzied hunger, stripping him to the bone within moments. The sea turned red, the water around the rocks churning with the feeding frenzy. When the bone pickers were finished, all that remained of Prince Arden were his bones, picked clean and left to drift in the currents. Days turned into weeks, and the kingdom mourned the loss of their beloved prince. Cedric played the part of the grieving brother well, his tears convincing even the most skeptical of onlookers. King Halvor, devastated by the loss of his heir, found solace in the fact that he still had one son to carry on his legacy, and so, preparations for Cedric's ascension to the throne and his marriage to Princess Elowin began. Meanwhile, far from the royal palace, a wandering bard named Alaric made his way along the shores of the Azure Sea. Alaric was known for his haunting melodies and the tales he wove with his music. He had traveled to Verilith in hopes of finding new stories to tell, new songs to sing. Alaric was no ordinary bard. He had a reputation for uncovering the hidden truths of the world, for finding the stories that others dared not tell. His music was both a gift and a curse, for while it brought him acclaim, it also brought him closer to the darkness that lurked in the hearts of men. Alaric had seen much in his travels, war and peace, love and loss, and the secrets that lay beneath the surface of every tale. One morning, as Alaric walked along the beach, his eyes caught something gleaming in the sunlight. It was a bone, polished smooth by the sea, washed ashore by the relentless tides. Alaric picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was long, slender, almost too perfect to be real. He felt an inexplicable connection to it, as if it was calling out to him. Alaric had always been drawn to the strange and unusual. He had crafted many instruments in his time, each with its own unique story and sound. But this bone felt different. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it held within it the echoes of the past. He sat on the beach, the waves gently lapping at the shore, and began to work. Alaric was a master craftsman, his hands skilled in the art of carving and shaping. He used a small knife, the blade sharp and precise, to carefully carve the bone. As he worked, he felt as though the bone was guiding his hand, revealing the form it wished to take. Hours passed, the sun moving across the sky, casting long shadows on the sand. Alaric worked in silence, his focus entirely on the bone in his hand. He carved delicate patterns into the bone, intricate designs that seemed to emerge from the material itself. The bone seemed to resist at times, as if reluctant to give up its secrets, but Alaric persisted. When he finished, The bone had been transformed into a fine flute. It was a work of art, the patterns on its surface telling a story that only Alaric could understand. The flute was unlike any he had ever made. It was beautiful with an eerie quality that made it seem almost alive. Alaric held up the flute to the light, admiring his handiwork. The bone had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality. The patterns etched into it, catching the sunlight in a way that made them seem to dance. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction, as if he had uncovered something ancient and powerful. That night, Alaric tested the flute. He brought it to his lips and played a simple tune. The sound that emerged was haunting, a melody that spoke of sorrow and loss, of love and betrayal. The notes seemed to weave a story of their own, one that Alaric could not fully grasp, but he knew without a doubt that this flute was special. The melody that flowed from the flute was unlike anything Alaric had ever played. It was as if the flute had a voice of its own, a voice that told of forgotten sorrows and hidden truths. The music was both beautiful and unsettling, a melody that lingered in the air long after the notes had faded. Alaric was mesmerized by the sound of the flute. It was as if the music held within it the very essence of the ocean, the crashing waves, the howling winds, the cries of unseen creatures beneath the depths. Each note resonated with a mournful sorrow, telling a story that Alaric could feel but not fully understand. The melody gripped his heart, and he felt an overwhelming sadness, as if the flute was drawing out emotions buried deep within his soul. For days Alaric played the flute, lost in its haunting melody. He wandered from village to village, his music drawing crowds wherever he went. People were captivated by the sorrowful tune, and many wept openly, though none could explain why. Alaric noticed that the flute's music had a strange effect on those who listened. Some felt a deep sense of loss, while others were gripped by a vague unease, as if the music had awakened something long forgotten. Despite the beauty of the music, Alaric could not shake the feeling that there was something more to the flute, something hidden beneath the surface. The bone from which it was crafted seemed almost too perfect, too smooth, as if it had been cleansed of all impurities. It was a strange and unsettling thought, but Alaric pushed it aside. The flute was his creation, and he was determined to uncover its secrets. One day, as he played his flute in a bustling marketplace, a man approached him. The man was well dressed, with an air of importance about him. He wore the colors of the royal court, and his expression was one of both curiosity and admiration.
"Your music is extraordinary," the man said, his voice filled with genuine wonder. "I have never heard anything like it before. The emotions you evoke with your playing is truly remarkable."
Alaric nodded politely, lowering the flute from his lips. "Thank you, my lord. I am but a humble bard, and I play what my heart tells me." The man smiled, though there was a hint of something more in his eyes, perhaps a sense of recognition, or even suspicion.
"I am Sir Gavian, an emissary of King Halvor. His Majesty has heard tales of a bard whose music moves the very soul, and he wishes for you to perform at the upcoming royal wedding."
Alaric's heart skipped a beat. The royal wedding? The marriage of Prince Cedric and Princess Elowen was the most anticipated event in the kingdom. To be invited to perform was an honor beyond measure, but Alaric felt a pang of unease. The flute's melody with its haunting sorrow seemed ill-suited for such a joyous occasion.
"His Majesty has a deep appreciation for music,"
Sir Gavin continued, noticing Alaric's hesitation.
He wishes for the wedding to be a celebration that will be remembered for generations. Your music will be the crown jewel of the festivities.
Alaric hesitated only for a moment before nodding. I am honored, my lord. I will perform at the wedding. As Sir Gavian left, Alaric's thoughts were troubled. The flute's melody seemed to carry a darkness he could not fully understand, and yet he felt compelled to accept the invitation. Perhaps, he thought, the music would take on a new meaning in the grand halls of the palace, surrounded by the joy of the wedding celebration. The day of the wedding arrived, and the royal palace was adorned with the finest decorations. Banners of gold and crimson fluttered in the breeze, and the air was filled with the scent of flowers and freshly baked bread. The kingdom had come together to celebrate the union of Prince Cedric and Princess Eowyn, a marriage that promised to bring peace and prosperity to Verilith. Alaric arrived at the palace, his flute carefully wrapped in a cloth and tucked into his satchel. He was greeted by servants who led him to the grand hall where the wedding feast would take place. The hall was magnificent, with towering columns and walls adorned with tapestries depicting the history of the kingdom. A long table stretched down the center of the hall, laden with food and drink fit for a king. As Alaric prepared for his performance, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The flute, it seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if it was alive. He unwrapped it and ran his fingers along the smooth surface, feeling the patterns he had carved so carefully. There was a story in those patterns, a story that was not his own. Guests began to arrive, filling the hall with laughter and conversation. The nobility of Verilith, dressed in their finest garments, took their seats at the table. King Halvor, looking weary but proud, sat at the head of the table, with Cedric and Eowyn by his side. The princess was radiant in her wedding gown, her beauty unmatched by any in the kingdom, but there was a shadow in her eyes, a sadness that Alaric could not ignore. When the guests settled, the king rose to speak.
My friends, my family, he began, his voice strong despite his age. Today we celebrate the union of my son, Prince Cedric, and the lovely Princess Eowyn. This marriage is a symbol of the strength and unity of our kingdoms, and I could not be more proud.
The guests applauded, raising their glasses in a toast. Cedric smiled, but there was a coldness in his eyes, a hidden arrogance that made Alaric uneasy. Eowyn, though smiling, seemed distant, as if her mind was elsewhere.
And now, the king continued, to mark this joyous occasion, we have invited a bard of great renown to perform for us. His music has been said to move the hearts of all who hear it. Please welcome Alaric of the Azure Shores.
Alaric stepped forward, the flute in his hands. The room fell silent as he raised the instrument to his lips. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the expectation around him. The flute felt heavy, almost as if it was resisting him, but he pushed the feeling aside and began to play. The first notes that filled the hall were soft, almost gentle, like a whisper of a breeze. But as Alaric continued, the melody deepened, growing more complex and sorrowful. The music seemed to take on a life of its own, weaving a tale of loss and betrayal, of love that had been torn apart. The guests listened in rapt attention, their expression shifting from joy to melancholy. Some wept openly, their tears falling into their wine. Even King Halvor seemed moved, his eyes misting over as the music washed over him. But as the melody continued, something strange began to happen. The flute seemed to vibrate in Alaric's hands, the notes growing louder and more intense. The patterns carved into the bone began to glow faintly, as if they were coming alive. Alaric tried to stop playing, but his fingers moved of their own accord, as if the flute was controlling him. The music grew more chaotic, the notes clashing and jarring, filling the hall with a sense of dread. And then, as if possessed by some unseen force, the flute slipped from Alaric's hands and floated into the air. The guests let out a large gasp in shock, some rising from their seats in fear. The flute hung in the air, suspended by an invisible power, and began to play on its own. The melody that emerged was no longer the sorrowful tune that Alaric had played. It was darker, filled with anger and pain. The flute played a haunting refrain, one that echoed through the hall like the wail of a ghost. As the music reached a fever pitch, the flute began to speak. The voice was that of Prince Arden, his soul trapped within the bone, his spirit seeking justice. "I was betrayed," the voice whispered, carrying through the hall like a cold wind. "By blood and bone, I was cast into the sea, my life taken by one that I called brother." The guests were frozen in terror, their faces pale as the flute continued its mournful tale. Cedric, who had been watching with a growing sense of dread, now stood, his eyes wide with horror. "No," he cried, his voice breaking. "This cannot be!" The flute ignored him, its voice growing louder. "The sea took my flesh, and the bone pickers left only my bones. But my soul lives on, bound to this flute, to tell the tale of my murder." The guests turned to Cedric, their eyes filled with horror and disbelief. Elowyn stared at him, her face white as a sheet. "Cedric, what have you done?" Cedric backed away, his hands trembling. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he stammered. I did it for the kingdom, for us." But the flute was relentless. "You will never know peace, Cedric. The throne you coveted will be your downfall. The crown you wear is stained with blood, and the kingdom you sought will crumble beneath your feet." Cedric screamed, the sound echoing through the hall. He lunged at the flute, trying to grab it, to silence it, but the flute evaded him, dancing just out of reach. The music continued, a dirge that filled the hearts of all who heard it with despair. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the flute fell silent. It dropped to the ground with a hollow clatter, the glow fading from the bone. The hall was deathly quiet, the air thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Cedric stumbled backwards, his hands shaking. "Father, it's not true." But the evidence was undeniable. The guests began to murmur, their voices rising in shock and outrage. Princess Elowyn stepped away from Cedric, her face ashen. You killed him?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You killed Arden?" Cedric's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was none. The truth had been laid bare before the entire court, and there was no way to hide from it. He fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head in despair. I had to take the throne. I had to have you, Elowyn." Cedric's voice was frantic, desperate. He would have taken it all. I had no choice. King Halvor's expression hardened, the grief and rage in his eyes unmistakable. "You had a choice, Cedric. You chose treachery. You chose to betray your brother, your family, and your kingdom. The guards moved forward, seizing Cedric by the arm. He did not resist, his strength drained by the weight of his guilt. As Cedric was led away, the nobles and guests watched in stunned silence. The joyous occasion had turned into a nightmare, and the legacy of Prince Arden's death would haunt the kingdom for years to come. Alaric stood in the center of the hall, the bone flute lying at his feet. He had not intended to become part of such a tale, but the forces that had guided him were beyond his understanding. The truth had been revealed, and justice would be served.